Amish girl said one thing, "I can give you 5 sons," and the mountain man replied, "That's all I need." It began in a snowstorm, high in the Colorado mountains, where a broken wagon left a young Amish girl with nothing but a Bible in her hands. The mountain man, scarred, silent, alone, took her in, and in the firelight she made a desperate promise. But what seemed like a fragile spark of family soon ignited into danger, because hidden inside her Bible was a deed land the railroad would kill to own. And the men who wanted it? They weren't strangers. They were kin. Barns will burn. Blood will spill. Faith will be tested. And a cabin meant for shelter may become a battlefield. She promised him 5 sons. But will they ever live to see the life she dreamed of? Or will the mountains swallow their hope forever? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The harsh mountain wind howled through the towering pines as Mark Brandt's boots crunched through knee-deep snow. His arms ached from swinging the axe all afternoon, but the bundle of firewood strapped to his back would keep his cabin warm through another bitter night. As the sun dipped behind the Colorado peaks, painting the snow-laden clouds in shades of purple and gold, an unfamiliar sound caught his ear. The distinct crunch of wagon wheels grinding against ice echoed through the valley, followed by the panicked whinnying of horses and a sickening crack of splintering wood. Mark's heart jumped into his throat. Nobody in their right mind would brave Henderson Pass this late in winter. He dropped his load and plowed through the deepening snow toward the sounds. His legs burned with every step as he rounded the bend where his worst fears materialized. Before him, a wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air. Dark shapes dotted the pristine white snow like fallen birds. "Hello?" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Anybody alive out here?" The only response was the soft hiss of falling snow and the creak of the broken wagon. Mark approached carefully, his stomach nodding as he recognized the simple black clothes and broad-brimmed hats. Amish travelers, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man and woman lay still, their skin already blue with frost. Mark touched their necks, knowing before he did that he'd find no pulse. The cold had claimed them quickly, at least. But movement caught his eye, a flutter of dark fabric against the white ground. A young woman huddled against the overturned wagon, her torn shawl offering little protection against the brutal cold. Her knuckles were white where they clutched a leather-bound Bible to her chest. She looked up at Mark with eyes bright with fever and desperation. "Can't feel my feet," she whispered through chattering teeth. Mama and Papa, they wouldn't wake. Up, Mark shed his heavy coat without hesitation, wrapping it around her slight frame. "I've got a cabin not far. Can you walk?" She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. Without another word, Mark scooped her into his arms. She weighed hardly more than a child, though her face showed her to be a young woman of perhaps 20 years. The Bible remained clutched tight against her chest as he carried her through the deepening twilight. His cabin appeared as a dark shape against the swirling snow, smoke curling from the stone chimney. Mark shouldered the door open, the warmth of the fire hitting them like a physical wave. He laid the woman gently on his narrow bed, piling every blanket he owned around her shivering form. "Name's Mark Brandt," he said gruffly as he stirred up the fire. "What's yours?" "Rowena," she managed between chattering teeth. "Rowena Yoder." Mark nodded, moving to the pot of soup that had been simmering all day. He ladled some into a tin cup, supporting Rowena's head as he helped her drink. She sputtered at first, but soon began taking eager sips of the hot broth. "My parents?" she asked, though her eyes said she already knew the answer. "I'm sorry," Mark said simply. The cold took them quick, nothing to be done. Rowena closed her eyes, tears freezing on her cheeks. The wind rattled the cabin's windows as silence stretched between them. When she opened her eyes again, they held a fierce determination that caught Mark off guard. "I can't go back," she said. "Uncle Jakob cast us out when Papa chose to leave the community. We were heading to Denver to start fresh." She drew a shaky breath. "I can work hard, cook, clean, tend garden come spring. I can give you 5 sons if you let me stay." Mark nearly dropped the soup cup. He stared at this strange woman, half frozen and newly orphaned, offering him a future he'd long since stopped dreaming about. The silence stretched thin as spider silk between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of snowmold hitting the hot stove. 5 sons, he repeated slowly, studying her face in the firelight. She met his gaze steadily, chin lifted despite her trembling. There was someone else who understood what it meant to be alone in the world, to grasp at any chance for belonging. "That's all I need," he said finally, the words coming out rough but sincere. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them together in this moment of desperate bargaining. But in the warm circle of firelight, something fragile and new had taken root. A chance at family, at healing, at hope. Morning light crept through the frost-edged windows of Mark's cabin. Rowena stirred beneath the pile of wool blankets, her eyes fluttering open to take in unfamiliar surroundings. Rough-hewn timber beams crossed the ceiling above her, and stacks of animal pelts lined the walls. Beaver, fox, and rabbit skins waiting to be traded come spring. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. Then, yesterday's memories crashed over her like ice water. The wagon's terrible lurch, her parents' still forms in the snow, the stranger carrying her through the storm. Her chest tightened with grief, but she forced herself to sit up, wrapping one of the blankets around her shoulders. Mark stood at the iron stove, his broad back turned to her as he worked the coffee pot. The bitter aroma filled the small cabin, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and leather. He glanced over his shoulder at her movement, nodding once in acknowledgement. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice gruff but careful, as if he wasn't used to speaking this early. "Got some venison left from yesterday, too." "Thank you," Rowena said softly, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was strong enough to make her eyes water, but the warmth helped chase away the lingering chill in her bones. She watched as Mark sliced pieces of dried venison, laying them on a wooden plate. "My brothers," she said suddenly, the memory striking her like lightning. When the wagon started to slide, they jumped. Samuel and Jacob. They're only 9 and 11. They might still be alive out there. Mark's hand stilled on the knife. He turned to study her face, his expression grave. The storm was fierce last night, but if they found shelter, he set the plate down. "We can search, soon as you've eaten something." Rowena forced herself to take small bites of the venison, though worry made her stomach clench. As she ate, Mark pulled out 2 pairs of wooden frames from behind the pelts. "Snowshoes," he explained, beginning to weave fresh rawhide through the holes. "Won't get far without them in drifts this deep." Rowena moved to help him, her fingers remembering the pattern from watching her father make similar repairs. They worked in silence for a time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of leather through wood. When the snowshoes were ready, Mark helped her into his old buffalo coat. The heavy fur swallowed her slight frame, but she welcomed its warmth. Outside, the storm had left behind a transformed world. Fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white, unmarred except for the tracks of winter birds near the cabin's edge. They made their way back to the wreck first, Mark showing her how to walk with the awkward snowshoes. The wagon stood like a dark wound against the brightness, already half buried in drifts. Rowena forced herself not to look at the shapes still lying nearby, now covered in snow. Her parents would need proper burial, but first she had to find her brothers. "Here," Mark called, pointing to smaller footprints leading away from the wagon. They headed toward the river. They followed the tracks, hope rising with each step. But as they drew closer to the rushing water, partially frozen under sheets of ice, Rowena's heart sank. Scattered in the snow lay familiar items, a pair of wool mittens her mother had knitted, chunks of the bread they'd packed for the journey to Denver. "The tracks stop here," Mark said quietly, scanning the riverbank. Could be they found better shelter downstream, but he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Rowena's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the snow. First her parents, now her little brothers, all gone in the space of a day. Tears froze on her cheeks as she gathered up the dropped mittens, clutching them to her chest. The trek back to the cabin seemed endless. By the time they arrived, the short winter day was already fading. Rowena's body ached with exhaustion and grief as she shed the heavy coat. "I cannot go back to the settlement," she said finally, watching Mark build up the fire. "Uncle Levi cast us out when Papa chose to leave. Said we were dead to him already." She swallowed hard. "Please, let me stay, at least until spring." Mark stood at the fireplace, shadows dancing across his features as he considered. Rowena moved to the stove, needing to keep her hands busy. She added wood, adjusted the damper like her mother had taught her. Without thinking, she began to hum one of the old hymns, her voice soft in the cabin's silence. When she looked up again, Mark was watching her with an unreadable expression. Something in his face had softened, though, as if the hymn had touched some long-buried memory. "Reckon you can stay," he said at last. "Till spring, at least. Won't turn anyone out in weather like this." Rowena nodded, relief washing through her. It wasn't much, a temporary shelter, a stranger's reluctant kindness. But for now, it was enough. The days settled into a gentle rhythm as January deepened. Mark rose before dawn, shouldering his rifle to track elk through the pristine snow. He'd return near dusk, stomping his boots clean on the cabin's threshold, often bearing fresh meat or trapped rabbits. Each time, the sight of smoke curling from his chimney and lamplight in the window gave him pause, reminders that his solitary life had shifted. Inside, Rowena kept busy from sunup to sundown, her hands already skilled from years of Amish. Living found endless tasks. She kneaded sourdough into hearty loaves that filled the cabin with the scent of baking bread. Her needle flashed steadily through Mark's collection of torn shirts and worn socks, mending what weather and work had rendered ragged, but it was her voice that transformed the cabin most. As she worked, hymns flowed from her lips, sometimes in English, sometimes in the German of her people. The melodies wrapped around Mark like invisible threads, softening the hard edges of his mountain solitude. He found himself pausing in his task just to listen, though he'd turn away gruffly if she noticed one evening. As they sat down to a simple supper of venison stew and fresh bread, Rowena folded her hands and bowed her head. "We always say grace," she explained softly. "Would you like to learn?" Mark shifted uncomfortably on his bench, but nodded. She taught him the words slowly, a plain Amish blessing that spoke of gratitude for daily bread and God's mercy. The German phrases felt clumsy on his tongue, but something in their gentle cadence stirred memories of his own mother's prayers, long forgotten. "Danke für unsere täglich Brot," he repeated after her, the words awkward but sincere. Rowena's smile warmed the room more than the fireplace. That night, the wolves came. Their howls started distant but grew closer, hungry songs carrying through the bitter cold. Mark woke instantly, reaching for his rifle. Rowena was already up, wrapping herself in his buffalo coat. "The mule," she whispered urgently. "I heard him stamping." Mark nodded grimly. That mule was his lifeline for trading come. Spring. He couldn't lose him to wolves. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Rowena was already lighting the lantern. "You'll need light to aim," she said firmly. "I'm coming." Together they stepped into the knife-edge cold. The moon cast blue shadows on the snow as they approached the small corral. Yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness. The wolf pack had the mule surrounded. The animal kicked and snorted in terror. His rope halter straining. Mark raised his rifle while Rowena lifted the lantern high. The wolves slunk back from the light but didn't retreat. Mark fired a warning shot into the air. The boom echoed off the mountainsides, and finally the pack melted away into the trees, their howls fading into the distance. The mule calmed under Rowena's gentle hands as she checked him for injuries. Finding none, they hurried back to the cabins. Warmth. Rowena's face was pale as she hung up the buffalo coat. "I fear being sent away more than I fear those wolves," she admitted quietly, staring into the fire. "When spring comes, you have a place here," Mark said, his tone guarded but genuine. "Long as you need it." He turned away quickly to stoke the fire, unused to making such promises. The snow continued to pile outside, great drifts reshaping the landscape daily. The weather pressed them into closer companionship, each learning the other's ways. Mark found himself speaking more, sharing knowledge of tracking and trapping. Rowena taught him to make noodles for soup, showing him how to roll the dough paper thin. One afternoon, while Mark mended harness leather near the stove, Rowena sat reading her Bible, the one possession she'd clung to during the crash. As she turned a page, several folded papers slipped from between the covers. Curious, she opened them, then gasped. "What is it?" Mark asked, looking up from his work. "Papa's land deed," Rowena whispered, her voice breaking. "For a homestead near Denver. It's signed, but..." Her hands trembled as she read. "Never filed with the land office. The man who sold it to us, he promised to file it himself. Took extra money for the service." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "We were cheated. That's why we were traveling in winter, rushing to fix it before spring planting." Mark set aside his work and crossed to examine the papers. The deed looked official enough, with signatures and seals, but without proper filing, it was worthless. His jaw tightened as he thought of Rowena's family, swindled by some smooth-talking land shark. "Come spring," he said carefully, "I'll help you look into this. Might be something can be done, if we can find the right officials." He handed the papers back, watching as she tucked them reverently into her Bible. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping her eyes with her apron. Papa would be grateful to know someone cared about justice. The first breath of spring whispered through the mountains in early March. Ice crackled and groaned as streams broke free of winter's grip, their voices joining the drip of melting snow from pine boughs. Inside the cabin, Mark watched the changing season with a mixture of anticipation and unease. It was time to make the journey down to town, to trade his winter's take of furs and replenish supplies. "We'll need flour and salt," Rowena said, carefully, writing out a list by lamplight. "And thread. I've nearly used up what was left." She glanced up at Mark, her plain cap framing worried eyes. "Are you certain I should come along?" Mark nodded, checking the leather straps on his pack frame. "Need your eye for proper goods. Besides," he added gruffly, "you've been cooped up here long enough." They set out at dawn, Mark leading his laden mule down the narrowing trail. Rowena walked beside him, her sturdy boots crushing the last patches of snow. Her plain dress and bonnet marked her as different from the corseted town ladies they'd meet, but she held her head high. Mark found himself admiring her quiet dignity. The small mountain town sprawled in the valley below, a collection of wooden buildings and muddy streets. As they made their way to the mercantile, whispers followed them like shadows. Women gathered in doorways, their faces pinched with curiosity and judgment. Mark heard fragments of their gossip about the strange Amish woman living alone with a mountain man, about propriety and scandal. Inside the mercantile, Mark spread his pelts on the counter while Rowena examined bolts of fabric. The shopkeeper was just counting out their payment when the bell above the door jangled harshly. "Rowena!" The voice cracked like a whip. She turned, face draining of color. "Uncle Levi." Levi Yoder stood in the doorway, his black coat dusty from travel. His stern face was carved with disapproval as he strode forward. "You will come with me now. This situation has gone on long enough." Mark stepped closer to Rowena, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The shopkeeper retreated to the back room, leaving them alone among the barrels and shelves. "I heard you survived the crash," Levi continued, his voice hard. "But instead of returning to your people, you choose to live in sin with this outsider?" He spat the last word like poison. "Mark saved my life," Rowena said quietly. "He has shown nothing but respect and kindness." "Kindness?" Levi's laugh was bitter. "You promised to Jacob Stoltzfus back in Pennsylvania. The arrangement was made before your father's foolish decision to leave. You will return with me and honor that commitment." Rowena's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "My parents are gone, Uncle. I am no longer under your authority. My place is here now. You would abandon your faith, your people's ways?" Levi demanded. "My faith is stronger than ever," Rowena answered. "God led me to shelter when I was lost. He provides daily bread and purpose. These are our ways too. Kindness to strangers, acceptance of his will." Mark moved forward, placing himself between Rowena and her uncle. "The lady has spoken her mind," he said quietly. "Best you respect that." Levi's face darkened with rage. "You dare interfere in family matters? She belongs with her own kind." "She belongs where she chooses," Mark replied, his voice low but firm. "This isn't finished," Levi snarled. He jabbed a finger at Rowena. "You will return to proper ways, girl. I'll see to that." He turned sharply and stalked out, the door slamming behind him. The journey back to the cabin was tense with unspoken fears. Dark had fallen by the time they arrived, and Rowena's hands shook as she lit the lamp. She sank into a chair, finally allowing tears to fall. Tears to fall. "I never thought he would find me here," she whispered. "He won't give up. I know him too well." Mark moved quietly around the cabin, checking the door's heavy bar, then taking down his rifle. He began cleaning it methodically, the familiar motions calming his anger. Then, surprising himself, he began to pray aloud. "Lord," he said roughly, "ain't been much for talking to you since my family passed. But this here woman needs protection, and I aim to provide it." He paused, loading fresh cartridges with careful hands. "Give me strength to do what's right, and wisdom to know the way." The words felt strange on his tongue, but somehow right. Rowena looked up, her tears slowing. "Amen," she whispered, and the cabin seemed to wrap them both in its sheltering warmth as night settled deep around them. A week after their confrontation in town, morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, catching dust motes as Mark and Rowena bent over her father's deed. The yellowed paper crackled as they spread it carefully on the rough-hewn table. Mark's finger traced the boundary descriptions while Rowena held down the curling corners. "Says here the southern line follows Elk Creek," Mark muttered, his brow furrowed. "That's prime bottomland, stretching clear down to the valley floor." He looked up, meeting Rowena's eyes. "Railroad's been sniffing around those parts, looking to lay track through the pass." Rowena's fingers tightened on the paper. "Is that why Father was so intent on filing this deed?" He mentioned meetings with men in town, but she trailed off, remembering her father's worried faces during those last weeks. "Reckon so." Mark straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Trail's too muddy now, but once it dries some, we should ride down to the county office." Get this properly recorded before anyone else tries claiming that land." Rowena nodded, carefully, folding the deed and returning it to her Bible. Through the open door, she gazed at the patch of earth behind the cabin where snow had recently melted. "Speaking of land," she said, a determined light in her eyes, "that spot there gets good sun. Time we had a proper garden." Mark opened his mouth to object. He'd always gotten by on hunting and basic stores, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he found himself helping her clear rocks from the soil that afternoon. Rowena worked steadily, her sleeves rolled up as she turned the dark earth with a borrowed spade. "The ground," she said, crumbling rich soil between her fingers. From her apron pocket, she pulled out a packet of pea seeds, clearly treasured. "These need planting early. My mother always said peas should feel frost to grow sweet." Mark watched as she pressed each seed into the earth with hopeful fingers, speaking quiet words of blessing over them. The sight stirred something in him, a memory of his own mother's garden. Long ago, their peaceful routine shifted the next morning when Mark discovered a boy huddled in his woodshed. The child started like a wild thing when Mark opened the door, pressing himself against the stacked logs. He was thin as a rail, with sharp eyes and clothes too warm for the mountain cold. "Easy now," Mark said softly, the way he'd approach her. "Spook deer. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Rowena appeared behind him, drawn by voices. "Oh," she exclaimed, then gentled her tone. "You must be frozen through. Come inside where it's warm." The boy hesitated, studying them both. Finally, hunger won over fear, and he followed them into the cabin. Rowena sat him by the fire, wrapping a quilt around his shoulders while she heated soup. "I'm Thomas," he finally said, clutching the warm bowl she gave him. "Please don't send me back. My stepfather," his voice caught. "He said I was nothing but trouble. Beat me something fierce and told me to clear out." Rowena's face softened with compassion. "No one's sending you anywhere," she assured him, sharing a quick glance. "With Mark, you're safe here." Throughout the day, Thomas gradually relaxed, helping Mark stack firewood and watching in fascination as Rowena kneaded bread dough. When evening came, he tried to return to the woodshed, but Rowena wouldn't hear of it. "There's a perfectly good bed in the lean-to," she insisted. "We'll make it up proper with fresh straw." That night, Thomas joined them at the supper table, his face freshly scrubbed. Rowena served him an extra helping of stew, her eyes bright with maternal pride. When she thought no one was looking, she mouthed the word "one," the first of her promised 5 sons. Mark watched them across the lamplight, Rowena showing Thomas how to sop up gravy with cornbread, the boy's shy smile as she praised his appetite. An unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, and he recognized it with a start. The feeling of family taking root, like Rowena's peas pushing up through spring soil. Thomas caught his eye, uncertain. Mark gave him a slight nod, and the boy's shoulders relaxed fully for the first time. Outside, an evening wind whispered through the pines, but inside the cabin, the air was rich with bread scent and quiet contentment. As they shared their first meal as something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. Spring painted the mountains with fresh color as Mark hitched the wagon for their journey to town. The morning air held a gentle warmth, carrying the scent of wild lupins that dotted the meadow. Rowena settled Thomas between herself and Mark on the wooden seat, her deed safely tucked in her Bible. The wagon wheels creaked along the muddy trail, Thomas pointing out deer tracks and hawk nests to pass the time. Mark kept one eye on the sky, watching storm clouds gather over distant peaks. "Best make good time," he said, clicking to the horses. "Weather's fixing to turn." The county clerk's office sat at the edge of town, a weathered building with uneven steps. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight while the clerk adjusted his spectacles to examine their papers. Three men in dark suits huddled by the window, their heads bent close in whispered conversation. Mark noticed their sharp glances as the clerk recorded Rowena's deed in the thick leather book. "Everything appears to be in order," the clerk announced, sanding the fresh ink. "Though unusual to see a claim filed so late after initial purchase, my father meant to file it," Rowena explained softly. "Before the accident." The men by the window shifted closer, and Mark caught fragments of their whispered words. "Railroad" and "survey stakes." His jaw tightened as he guided Rowena and Thomas outside, keeping himself between them and the stranger's calculating stares. They were halfway home when they came upon a broken-down wagon beside the trail. Its rear wheel had slipped off, leaving an elderly woman stranded with her ox and meager belongings. She stood wringing her hands, her gray hair escaping a neat bun. "Mrs. Carver?" Rowena called out, recognizing the former schoolteacher from town. The woman's face crumpled with relief. "Oh, thank heavens. I was beginning to think I'd spend the night out here." Mark swung down from their wagon, already rolling up his sleeves. "Let's have a look at that wheel." He knelt in the mud, examining the damage while Rowena and Thomas helped Mrs. Carver gather scattered belongings. "I'm moving up valley," Mrs. Carver explained, her voice wavering. "After James, my husband, passed from the fever this winter, I couldn't manage the townhouse alone." Rowena touched her arm gently. "You must join us for supper tonight. It's too late to continue your journey anyway." Mark worked steadily, using his hunting knife to whittle a new pin for the wheel hub. The sun hung low by the time he fitted everything back together, his hands grimy with axle grease. "Much obliged," Mrs. Carver said, but Rowena wouldn't hear of her traveling further. "You'll stay with us tonight," she insisted. "We've plenty of room." Mark caught her eye, knowing their cabin was already crowded, but something in Rowena's determined expression made him nod in agreement. That evening, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the aroma of rabbit stew. Mrs. Carver sat beside the hearth, her shoulders gradually relaxing as she sipped hot tea. "It's been so quiet," she confessed, tears gathering in her eyes. "James and I taught together for 20 years. Now the silence in that house." She pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Rowena settled beside her, taking her weathered hand. "Then, you must stay with us a while, until you find your feet again." Mark expected to feel crowded, uncomfortable with another person invading his space. Instead, watching Mrs. Carver help Rowena wash dishes while Thomas cleared the table, he felt something settle in his chest. That night, he built an extra bunk in the lean-to, the sound of women's soft laughter and Thomas's eager questions drifting through the cabin walls. Later, as crickets chirped outside, Rowena spread her Bible on the table. Thomas sat beside her, brow furrowed in concentration as she guided his finger across the words. "Sound it out slowly," she encouraged. "Like we practiced." In the beginning, Thomas read carefully, "God recreated the heavens and the earth." Mrs. Carver looked up from her mending, smiling. "You're a natural teacher, Rowena, just like I used to be." Mark paused in his whittling, watching them gathered around the lamp's golden circle. The cabin that had once echoed with his solitude now hummed with life. Rowena's quiet hymns, Thomas's stumbling letters, Mrs. Carver's gentle corrections. Their odd family fitting together like the pieces of the quilt Rowena was stitching, each patch adding its own color to the whole. Outside, spring rain began to fall, drumming softly on the cabin roof. But inside, warmth and companionship kept the darkness at bay as they sat together, bound by something stronger than blood or circumstance. Summer sunlight spilled across the valley like honey, warming the fresh-cut timber laid out for the barn raising. Wagons circled the clearing on Rowena's land, their wheels throwing dust into the golden morning air. Mark stood back, watching. Folks stream in from every direction. Weathered farmers in patched overalls, women carrying covered dishes, children darting between the grown-ups like excited puppies. Henry, the Ute Scout, rode in on his paint pony, nodding quietly to Mark. "Good day for building," he said, dismounting with fluid grace. His dark eyes took in the scene. The foundation stones already laid, the massive beams waiting to be raised. "Much obliged for coming," Mark answered, clasping his hand. He'd known Henry for years, trusted his steady ways and keen judgment. The scout had helped them survey the land boundaries when they'd first decided to build here. Rowena emerged from their temporary cooking shelter, her apron dusted with flour, face glowing. "Welcome, friend Henry," she called, offering him a fresh sweet roll. The scout accepted with a small smile, touching his chest in thanks. The morning filled with the rhythmic thud of mallets and the creak of ropes as men heaved the heavy beams. Skyward, Mark's muscles strained alongside his neighbors, their breaths coming hard as they wrestled each timber into place. Henry worked shoulder to shoulder with them, his quiet strength earning respectful nods from the other men. From the makeshift kitchen, women's voices mixed with the clatter of pots and pans. Rowena moved among them like a conductor leading an orchestra, directing the preparation of feast day dishes. The aroma of baking bread and apple pies drifted across the worksite, spurring the men to greater efforts. By midday, the barn skeleton rose stark against the blue sky. Someone brought out a fiddle, and toe-tapping music floated through the air. It wove between the solemn notes of an Amish hymn, started by some of Rowena's people who'd come despite her uncle's disapproval. The blended music seemed to lift the spirits of all present, making the work lighter. "Never thought I'd see such a gathering in this valley," Mrs. Carver remarked, helping Rowena arrange pies on rough plank tables. Thomas darted past with a pitcher of lemonade, carefully serving the workers. "It gives me hope," Rowena replied softly, watching the diverse group working together. "This is how community should be." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the last beams settled into place. Cheers erupted from the workers, hats tossed high. Mark stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow, to admire their handiwork. The barn stood proud and true, its fresh-cut timbers catching the slanting sunlight. Rowena appeared at his side, offering a dipper of cool water. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Their eyes met, and Mark felt something shift in his chest at her radiant smile. For the first time since she'd arrived in winter's grip, he allowed himself to laugh softly with her, the sound natural and unguarded. The celebration moved to the cook fire as dusk painted the sky in purple and gold. Lanterns twinkled like earthbound stars while folks gathered to share the feast. Henry sat cross-legged near the fire, sharing stories with Thomas about tracking elk through mountain valleys. The peaceful scene fractured briefly as hoofbeats approached. A group of railroad men rode past the edge of the gathering, their faces hard in the firelight. Mark tensed, noting how their eyes lingered on the new barn on the fertile valley land. At their heels rode Rowena's uncle, Levi Yoder, his stern face set in familiar lines of disapproval. He bent close to the railroad men, speaking in low tones before they moved on into the gathering darkness. Rowena's hand found Mark's, squeezing gently. She drew him aside, away from the fire's glow, and knelt in the sweet summer grass. "Join me?" she asked softly, opening her worn Bible. Mark hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside her. The familiar words of her prayer washed over him, different now from the first time he'd heard them in his cold cabin. "Lord," Rowena prayed, her voice clear and steady, "thank you for this day of community and joy. Watch over our little family, Thomas, Mrs. Carver, Mark, and all who shelter beneath our roof. Protect what we're building here, not just this barn, but the bonds between neighbors. Help us stand firm against those who would divide us." Mark found himself bowing his head, her words echoing in his heart. For the first time, he didn't feel awkward participating in her evening ritual. The gesture felt right, like the last piece of something falling into place. They rose together, rejoining the circle around the fire where Thomas was falling asleep against Mrs. Carver's shoulder. Henry sat nearby, keeping silent watch while children played and adults chatted. The new barn loomed above them all, solid and sheltering, its shadow stretching across the land they'd come to love. The harvest moon hung full and bright over the valley as autumn painted the mountains in amber and gold. Inside the new barn, lanterns cast warm light across mountains of grain sacks and rustling corn stalks hung from the rafters. The sweet scent of drying hay mingled with fresh-turned earth from the day's work. Mark paused at the barn door, watching Rowena direct Thomas and 3 neighbor children in sorting seed corn. Her voice carried clear and gentle as she showed them how to check each ear for quality. The children's laughter echoed in the high beams as they turned the task into a game, competing to find the biggest kernels. "You're good with them, Mark," said softly when she approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Rowena smiled, touching his arm. "They bring such life to this place. Did you see Thomas teaching little Sarah to read yesterday? He's come so far since spring." Together they worked through the afternoon, shoulders brushing as they hefted grain sacks and checked the drying tobacco leaves. The easy rhythm of their partnership had grown familiar over the months, the way she anticipated his needs, how he steadied her on the ladder, their quiet exchanges of glances that needed no words dot as sunset painted the barn walls golden. Mark's heart thundered in his chest. He'd been carrying his mother's ring in his pocket for weeks, waiting for the right moment. This wasn't the desperate bargain of that snowy night anymore. This was choice, pure and simple. "Rowena," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She turned from hanging a bundle of herbs, her eyes questioning. "I reckon I ain't much for fancy words, but..." He pulled out the simple gold band. "Would you stay? Not because you need to, but because we belong together now. You and Emmy and this family we've made." Tears spilled down Rowena's cheeks as she nodded, her smile brighter than the harvest moon. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh yes, Mark." The ring slipped perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment. Mark gathered her close, breathing in the scent of herbs and happiness that was uniquely Rowena. Their quiet joy soon rippled outward. Mrs. Carver appeared with a still warm apple pie, her own eyes misty as she hugged them both. Thomas bounced with excitement, already calling Mark Pa without hesitation. Even Henry rode in from his patrol route, bringing tender smoked venison and a beaded leather pouch for Rowena. "Many blessings," the scout said simply, touching his chest in the gesture they'd come to know meant respect and friendship. "You have built good medicine here, healing for many hearts." They shared the impromptu feast on the barn's fresh wooden floor, their small family circle complete. Thomas regaled them with tales of his adventures with the neighbor children, while Mrs. Carver shared stories of her own courtship days. The autumn evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of promise, but the peace didn't last. 3 days later, Mark was mending fence when he spotted unfamiliar men moving along the valley's edge. Their surveying equipment glinted in the sun as they hammered wooden stakes into the ground, marking boundaries that cut through Rowena's deeded land. His hands tightened on the fence post. The railroad was making its move, just as they'd feared since finding that deed in Rowena's Bible. He watched the strangers work their way along the creek, their measuring chains stretching across land that had nourished their summer garden and autumn harvest. That evening, after Thomas was asleep and Mrs. Carver had retired to her room, Rowena pulled out her father's Bible. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked the precious deed deeper between its pages. "We knew they would come," she said quietly, smoothing the worn leather cover, "but I didn't think it would be so soon after." She touched the ring on her finger, anxiety shadowing the joy that had lived there just days before. Mark wrapped his arms around her shoulders, solid and steady. That deed's legal and file proper. They can't just take what's yours. Ours, Rowena corrected softly. What's ours, Mark? This land, this home, this family, we'll protect it together. She leaned back against his chest, both of them watching the harvest moon rise through the window. The deed lay safe in its hiding place, but the stakes planted along their boundaries cast long shadows in the silvery light. Their future stretched before them, full of both promise and uncertainty. Like the valley itself in the gathering dusk dawn, the midnight hour stretched dark and cold across the valley. Inside the cabin, Rowena stirred restlessly in her sleep while Mark kept watch by the window, something unsettling in the autumn air. Even the crickets had fallen silent. The thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. Dozens of riders emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden beneath bandanas. Mark grabbed his rifle, but they were already surrounding the cabin and barn. "Rowena!" he shouted. "Get Thomas and Mrs. Carver to the root cellar." Flames erupted at the barn's edge, where railroad men flung burning torches. The dry hay caught instantly, sending orange flames climbing the newly raised timbers. Their summers. Work transformed into an inferno against the star-filled sky. Horses screamed in terror as masked men broke down the corral fences. The livestock scattered into the darkness, hooves thundering across the frost-covered ground. The family's milk cow, chickens, and Mark's faithful mule disappeared into the night. Mark fired a warning shot, but 3 men tackled him from behind. Fists rained down as they dragged him into the yard. He fought desperately, managing to throw one attacker off before a rifle butt cracked across his skull. Pain exploded behind his eyes as he stumbled. "Stop! Please stop!" Rowena's voice cut through the chaos. She stood in the cabin doorway, clutching her father's Bible to her chest, her white nightgown ghostly in the firelight. A familiar figure stepped forward, removing his hat. Uncle Levi's face glowed orange in the barn fire's reflection. "Where's the deed, Rowena? End this foolishness now." "Uncle, how could you?" Rowena's voice broke with betrayal. "This is our home." "The railroad requires this land," Uncle Levi said coldly. "You'll return to the settlement where you belong. The deed, girl. Now. Never." Rowena backed away, but 2 men grabbed her arms. Uncle Levi pointed to her Bible. "There. She keeps it between the pages." Mark struggled to rise, blood streaming down his face. "Leave her be." Another blow sent him crashing to his knees. Through blurred vision, he saw them wrench the Bible from Rowena's grasp. The precious deed fluttered as they tore it free. "Get her in the wagon," Uncle Levi ordered. "The railroad will handle the paperwork tomorrow." Rowena fought like a wild thing as they dragged her across the yard. "Mark! Mark, please!" Inside the cabin, Thomas huddled against Mrs. Carver in the root cellar, both trembling as boots thundered overhead. The boy pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out Rowena's screams and the crash of overturned furniture. The barn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Strange, cold flakes began drifting down, snow falling months too early, as if nature itself mourned their loss. The white flakes hissed as they met the flames, turning to steam in the heated air. Mark crawled forward on hands and knees, his vision fading in and out. "Rowena," he whispered, reaching toward the wagon as it pulled away. Her pale face appeared briefly in the back, tears streaming, before darkness swallowed her. The riders departed as swiftly as they'd come, hoofbeats fading into the night. Mark slumped forward into the mud, blood mixing with early snow. The barn burned lower, its light dimming as snow fell faster, beginning to shroud the smoking ruins in white. Thomas crept from the root cellar, Mrs. Carver close behind. They found Mark unconscious in the yard, his breathing shallow. Together, they managed to drag him inside, away from the falling snow. "Pa? Pa, please wake up." Thomas sobbed, pressing a cloth to Mark's bleeding head. Mrs. Carver built up the fire and tended Mark's wounds with shaking hands. "He's strong, Thomas. He'll survive this." But even as she spoke, Mark stirred fitfully, murmuring only one word again and again: "Rowena." Outside, the unseasonable snow fell thicker, as if trying to bury their shattered dreams. The barn's embers sizzled and died under the white blanket, leaving only darkness where their happiness had blazed so brightly just hours before. Their home lay broken, their family torn apart, while the night grew ever colder around them. The pale dawn crept across the valley, revealing the devastation in harsh detail. Where their beautiful barn had stood, only blackened timbers remained, dusted with unseasonable snow. The morning light filtered through the cabin's windows, touching Mark's bruised face as he finally stirred to consciousness. Mrs. Carver sat beside him, replacing a damp cloth on his forehead. "Easy now," she murmured. "You took quite a beating." Mark's entire body ached as he tried to sit up. His head throbbed where they'd struck him, and Mrs. Carver's careful bandaging couldn't hide the severity of his wounds. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. "Rowena," he whispered, his voice rough. "They took her." "Yes." Mrs. Carver's eyes filled with tears. "The railroad men and her uncle. They burned our barn and stole the deed." Mark slumped back against the pillows, despair washing over him like a dark tide. Everything they'd built together, all their dreams of family and future, gone in one violent night. He'd failed to protect her, failed to keep their home safe. The weight of his weakness crushed down on his spirit. "What's the use?" he muttered, turning his face to the wall. "Everything I touch turns to ashes. Should have known better than to think I deserved happiness." "No." Thomas burst out from where he'd been hovering nearby. The boy rushed to Mark's bedside, his young face streaked with tears, but determined. "You can't give up. Ma needs you. We all need you." Mark's throat tightened at hearing Thomas call Rowena May for the first time. The boy grabbed his hand, pleading. "Please, Pa. You gotta help her. You're the strongest person I know. Don't. Let them win." Before Mark could respond, boots crunched on the snow outside. Mrs. Carver reached for the rifle, but it was Henry who appeared in the doorway, his normally calm face tight with urgency. "Brother," the Ute Scout said, crossing to Mark's bedside. "I have news. The railroad men took your woman to their mountain camp up near Timberline. They're holding her there until papers can be forged." Mark struggled to sit up straighter, hope warring with pain. "You're sure?" Henry nodded. "I tracked them through the night. The camp is well guarded, but I know those paths. There may be a way." Mark's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to leap up, to ride out immediately, but his battered body betrayed him. Even sitting upright sent waves of dizziness through him. How could he help Rowena in this state? For the first time in years, he felt the urge to pray. But the words stuck in his throat, bitter with doubt. What kind of God would let this happen? What divine plan could possibly justify such cruelty to someone as good and faithful as Rowena? "I don't understand," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to Henry or to God. Why did he let them take her? Where was he when they burned our home? Mrs. Carver touched his shoulder gently. "Perhaps he's waiting to see what we'll do with our free will, whether we'll choose hope over despair, love over hatred." High in the mountain camp, Rowena sat alone in a crude cell, little more than a storage shed with a heavy lock. Her uncle had taken her Bible, but they couldn't take the words written on her heart. As night fell and the guards built their fires, she began to sing softly, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." A clear voice carried through the thin walls. In neighboring cells, other prisoners, homesteaders, who'd also defied the railroad, fell silent, listening. Some began humming along. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Rowena's voice trembled, but didn't break. Though fear gnawed at her heart, she clung to her faith like a lifeline in the darkness. She didn't know if Mark had survived, if Thomas and Mrs. Carver were safe, if she'd ever see her home again. But she knew God hadn't abandoned her, even here. The hymn rose into the cold mountain air, drifting past the guards who shifted uncomfortably at their posts. It spoke of grace in darkness, of hope beyond despair, of a love stronger than any earthly power. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. In the cells around her, more voices joined in, harmonizing in the night. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a declaration of faith, a refusal to be broken. Rowena closed her eyes, picturing Mark's face, remembering Thomas's smile, feeling Mrs. Carver's gentle hands. Whatever came next, their love had made them family. No one could take that away. The hymn floated down the mountainside like a prayer, carrying her heart's deepest truth. Even in their separation, faith bound them together. Somewhere in the darkness, Mark was fighting his way back to her, and she would keep singing, keep believing, until they found each other again. Henry didn't waste a day. As dawn broke over the mountain valley, he rode from homestead to homestead, his quiet voice carrying urgent purpose. At each stop, he shared the tale of the midnight raid, of Rowena's capture, of Mark's beating. The story spread like wildfire through the scattered community that Mrs. Carver and Thomas took the wagon into town, their faces set with determination as they climbed the weathered steps to the white-painted church. Inside, they found Preacher Matthews organizing his Sunday texts. "Sir," Thomas spoke up, his young voice steady. "We need your help. The railroad men, they took Miss Rowena." Mrs. Carver laid a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Preacher, you've seen how that woman brought light to our valley, how she fed the hungry, taught the children, showed kindness to all. Now she needs our help." The preacher listened, his weathered face growing grave. "Some folks here were suspicious of her Amish ways at first," he admitted. "But I've watched her live her faith through actions, not just words. That speaks louder than any doctrine." Back at the cabin, Mark forced himself to stand straighter despite the pain that wrapped his ribs like iron bands. His fingers traced the stock of his old rifle as he cleaned it methodically. The metal felt cold, promising violence, but Rowena's voice echoed in his memory, soft and clear as she'd once said, "Family is not built by the bullet, but by the heart." He paused, the cleaning cloth still in his hand. She'd changed him, shown him a different kind of strength. Yet here he was, preparing for battle. "You're thinking hard, brother," Henry observed from the doorway. Mark nodded. "About what's right, about what builds something lasting. The spirit must be strong before the hand can act wisely," Henry said, settling near the hearth. "Come, you need food and rest if you're to help her." Days passed in careful preparation. Mark pushed himself to rebuild his strength, though his wounds protested. Each morning, he walked further, carried more, stretched his muscles until they remembered their purpose. Thomas watched anxiously, bringing him water and worrying when Mark pushed too hard. "Pa," the boy said one afternoon, the name still new on his tongue. "You gotta pace yourself. Ma wouldn't want you hurting worse." Mark's heart clenched at the boy's concern, at how naturally he'd begun calling them Ma and Pa. "You're right, son," he answered softly. "Your ma taught me that sometimes the strongest thing is knowing when to rest." Neighbors began arriving, bringing supplies and offering help. Even old Jake Murphy, who'd once muttered about strange Amish ways, rode up with his sons and a wagon of provisions. "That woman of yours," Jake said gruffly, She brought my Mary soup when the fever took her. Sat up all night, singing them hymns. Reckon we owe her something for that. As dusk settled over the valley, the group gathered around campfires to plan. Henry's knowledge of the mountain paths proved invaluable as they traced routes through the timberline. Mark studied the maps, his body healing, but his spirit still troubled. One night, as the others slept, Mark found Henry keeping watch by the dying fire. The Ute scout's face was thoughtful in the fading light. "I keep thinking of pulling the trigger," Mark admitted, his voice low, "of making them pay for what they did. But then I hear her voice, singing them hymns about mercy." Henry nodded slowly. "The path of vengeance is like a swift river. It carries you far from where you meant to go." He stirred the embers, sending sparks into the dark. "Your woman understands this. She fights with love, not hatred. Perhaps that is why so many have come to help. She showed them a better way." Mark watched the sparks fade against the star-filled sky. "I was so alone before her," he said. "Thought I needed nothing but my own strength. Now, I understand. Real strength comes from joining hands, from building something together." "Then honor her teaching," Henry replied. "Let us free her not with blood, but with justice. The law is on your side. The deed is real. Their actions criminal. We have witnesses now and numbers. Sometimes the greatest victory is winning without firing a shot." The night deepened around them as Mark pondered these words. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered, lone voices finding each other in the darkness. Like Rowena had found him, like their patchwork family had found each other. As the fire burned down to ash, Mark made his decision. They would rescue Rowena, yes, but they would do it her way. The way that built bridges instead of burning them. The way that might leave room for healing, even after so much hurt. They would set out at first light, their party strong with purpose. Mark touched his rifle one last time, then covered it with a blanket. Tomorrow would test his newfound faith in a different kind of strength, the kind Rowena had been teaching him all along. Snow crunched under Rowena's boots as she trudged between the cook tent and the supply wagon. Her plain dress was smudged with soot, her hands raw from working the heavy iron pots. The railroad cab sprawled across the mountain meadow, a maze of canvas tents and smoking fires that had trampled the wild summer flowers into mud. 2 guards watched her constantly, rifles propped against their legs. They never spoke, just followed her movements with cold eyes. Rowena kept her head high, though her heart ached. She'd been here 5 days now, forced to cook for the growing crew of railroad men. The morning air bit sharp as she kindled the breakfast fire. Her fingers trembled as she stacked kindling, but not from cold. Each dawn brought fresh demands from her uncle to sign away her land. Each dawn, she refused. "Girl," Uncle Levi's voice cut through the thin mountain air. He approached, his beard streaked with gray, his Amish hat casting shadows across his face. "You test my patience. The papers are ready." Rowena straightened, clutching her worn Bible closer. It was all they'd let her keep, perhaps thinking it would soften her resolve. Instead, its presence gave her strength. "I will not sign, Uncle." This land was Father's dream, a place where faith could grow free from those who would control it. "Your father was a fool," he spat, "running from proper order, proper ways. Now look where his dreams have left you, alone, fallen in with that mountain man." He thrust a stack of papers toward her. "Sign. The railroad offers fair price." "Not alone," Rowena said softly, thinking of Mark, of Thomas, of Mrs. Carver, and their growing family. Never alone. The camp began stirring as railroad crews emerged from their tents. Rowena turned back to her fire, adding coffee to the pot. Her uncle's boots scraped away through the frost-covered grass. She hummed a hymn under her breath, the same one she'd taught Mark that evening by their own hearth. The memory warmed her more than any fire could. Railroad Agent Carter appeared at her elbow, his suit pristine despite the rustic surroundings. "My men are hungry, Miss Yoder. I trust you'll have breakfast ready soon?" His polite words carried steel beneath them. "The food will be ready when God wills it," Rowena answered, her voice steady. She stirred the porridge slowly, deliberately. Carter's smile tightened. "God helps those who help themselves, my dear, and those who know when to accept progress." He nodded toward the papers her uncle had left. "The railroad is coming. Better to profit than to be crushed beneath its wheels." Rowena said nothing, but her grip on the wooden spoon strengthened. She'd seen the railroad's idea of progress. Burned barns, scattered families, broken promises. The memory of Mark lying beaten in the snow flashed through her mind, strengthening her resolve. As the sun crept higher, the camp grew louder with the sounds of men gathering for breakfast. The guards at her fire had begun passing a bottle between them, their faces growing red in the dawn light. Rowena noticed their rifles leaning forgotten against a log as they argued over the last drops. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow among the trees that didn't belong. Her heart leaped, but she kept her face calm, continued stirring the porridge. More shadows slipped between the pines. She recognized Henry's careful stride, Mrs. Carver's determined shape, and finally, her breath caught Mark's broad shoulders. They were coming for her. Rowena began singing softly, an old hymn about deliverance. The sound carried across the clearing, making several men pause in their breakfast preparations. Her uncle scowled from his seat by Carter's tent, but she sang on, her voice growing stronger with each verse. The guards were fully drunk now, laughing. Too loud, their weapons forgotten. Other railroad men had joined them, drawn by the whiskey and the early morning chill. Carter emerged from his tent, frowning at the disorder in the trees. Mark crouched behind a fallen log, his heart pounding at the sound of Rowena's voice. Henry touched his arm, pointing to the scattered guards, the distracted crew. The moment they'd waited for was coming. Thomas had begged to come along, but they'd left him safely with the preacher's wife. Still, Mark felt the boy's fierce hope with him, spurring him forward. Mrs. Carver and the others waited in position, ready to create the diversion they planned. Mark closed his eyes briefly, the words feeling strange but right on his lips. "Lord," he whispered, "guide our hands. Help us bring her home." Around him, he sensed his companions bow their heads, joining his prayer. Rowena's hymn soared clear in the morning air, strong with faith despite her captivity. Mark caught Henry's eye and nodded. The time had come. He raised his hand, ready to signal the attack. Mark's signal sparked instant chaos. Henry and 3 settlers burst from the trees, brandishing rifles. Mrs. Carver led another group from the opposite side, carrying heavy sticks and tools. The drunken guards scrambled for their forgotten weapons, but Mark's people were faster, kicking the rifles away. "Nobody needs to die today," Mark shouted, his voice carrying across the camp. He kept his rifle raised but pointed skyward. "We're here for justice, not blood." Railroad men stumbled from their tents, but found themselves surrounded. Henry and the settlers worked quickly, using rope from the supply wagon to bind hands. Carter tried to slip away, but Mrs. Carver herself caught him with a swing of her walking stick. Rowena ran to Mark's side, her Bible clutched tight. "You came," she whispered. "Always will," he answered, then turned to face the gathered crowd. From his coat, he pulled Rowena's deed, now crumpled, but still legal. His voice grew stronger as he read the document aloud, each word clear in the morning air. "This land was purchased fair and square," he declared. "Any attempt to seize it through force or fraud is against the law." Right on time, The town preacher appeared with more settlers in tow. They filled the edges of the camp, bearing witness. Behind them came 3 county deputies, summoned by telegraph the day before. Rowena stepped forward, facing her uncle, who stood rigid with anger. "You would steal from your own blood," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "But my sons, yes, uncle, my sons to come, they will be born in freedom, not under your bondage. They will know God's love, not man's greed." The shame finally cracked Levi's stern face. His shoulders slumped, and without a word, he turned away, slipping through the crowd. The deputies moved efficiently, clapping irons on Carter first. Attempted land theft, assault, kidnapping, they listed. The circuit judge will be mighty interested in this case. As the railroad men were led away, Rowena leaned against Mark's shoulder, exhaustion and relief mingling in her tears. Around them, their neighbors gathered close, offering support and congratulations. Justice had come not through violence, but through courage and law. Golden leaves danced on the breeze as townsfolk gathered at the small white church. Through its windows, autumn sunlight painted the wooden pews in warm hues. Mrs. Carver arranged wildflowers along the aisle while Thomas fidgeted with his borrowed Sunday collar. Henry stood quietly near the back, his weathered face softened by a rare smile. Inside the crowded room, neighbors who had once viewed Amish ways with suspicion now sat shoulder to shoulder with settlers and mountain folk alike. The worn floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and hymns drifted through the open windows into the crisp mountain air. Rowena stood before the altar in her simple dress, a fresh white bonnet framing her face. Her eyes shone with joy as she gazed at Mark, who looked almost transformed in his clean black coat. His usual stern expression had melted into something tender and wondering. "I take thee," Rowena's voice carried clear and strong through the church, "to be my husband, before God and these witnesses." Her hands were steady as they held Mark's rough ones. Mark's own vows came out husky with emotion. "I take thee as my wife," he said, "and promise to cherish you all my days." The preacher smiled as he pronounced them married. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As evening approached, lanterns cast a warm glow over the feast tables set up outside. Children darted between adults' legs, while plates were filled with Mrs. Carver's pies and Henry's venison stew. Thomas helped serve, proud in his role as their first son. Mark drew Rowena close, watching their gathered family, blood kin or not, celebrate together. "Remember that night in the storm?" he whispered. "When you promised me 5 sons?" Rowena nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Looking at our family now," Mark continued, a real smile breaking across his face, "for the first time in years, that's all I need." Their cabin glowed in the distance, windows bright with lamplight. Where once silence had ruled, now laughter echoed across the valley. Against the backdrop of towering mountains painted in autumn colors, their home stood as a beacon of hope and new beginnings. The mountains rose dark against the evening sky, but here, surrounded by their chosen family, Mark and Rowena had found their light. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection. Go and hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.